Oh, here we are.
So it goes live.
Cool. So I guess we should wait for people to jump in, do we?
Yeah, I will. I'm going now about it. Okay, hello everyone.
Hello.
So let's kind of wait a little bit so everyone can join the webinar, and then we will start.
Are we supposed to have a commenting stream or something on the right? Or how does it work?
No, if
Okay.
people have some comments, they can like write in the under the live in the Facebook. So I will look at the questions. If there are any, I will tell you. Don't worry.
Cool. You know, it's Independence Day in Estonia today.
I see that they are joining.
Perfect.
Okay. Let's wait just like one minute, and then I will start.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I guess we can start.
Perfect. Hello, everyone.
Hello, everyone. So let me say a couple of words. So I'm excited to announce that BANA launched ScaleUP Webinars, a new series of online live events in which top global and local experts from different spheres, including marketing, finance, business development, advertising, branding, will share their experiences and knowledge with the bright Armenian founders. So what's the goal of the ScaleUP webinars? The goal is to educate the Armenian tech ecosystem startups by providing practical knowledge from the local and global experts. The content of the webinars is going to be focused on startup-related topics mainly, and the critical questions that the startups have. So startup founders, if you have like any suggestions for the challenging topics that you need advising on, or it's just interesting for you to hear, just suggest to me and we will consider them during our next webinars. So today we have a special guest. Today's guest is Kevin, Investment Associate at Funderbeam, and he will talk about fundraising for early stage startups from A to Z. So, Kevin, how are you? How do you feel?
I'm good, thank you. So yeah, like you mentioned, I've been working at Funderbeam. So I'll briefly, I think, give a little bit of context on what I've been doing the last few years so that you guys can understand a little bit about what industry I work in and also what stage of investment do I work for. Because when you mention fundraising, I mean, investing from A to Z, it's a very wide topic. And I guess I focus more on the early stage side of investment. But essentially, I've been working at a funding platform called Funderbeam, born in Estonia. What we're doing, we're working with thousands of investors all around the world, and we aggregate these investments and these investors to fund companies, early stage companies. I first worked in the Baltics for a few years in Estonia, startup nation. Then I moved to Spain and Portugal, where I was working in that ecosystem, working with investors and working with startups. And later on, I worked in Scandinavia, so mainly Denmark and Norway, though I worked a lot in Sweden and in Iceland. And the idea was that my job is essentially about finding cool companies and very cool projects. I'm sure many of you are working on many cool projects, and I'm always super happy to hear about what you guys are doing, and find some interesting project to potentially invest in. And as you will see, and as I'll try to explain, the investment process is a very long and very semi-complex things. It can be very easy for some and very complicated for others. But the idea here is that I help companies essentially figuring out what are the first steps to reach out to investments essentially. Now I work more in the background in Estonia, so I'm back in Estonia. I work more in the background in the investment management processes, where it's more about, the company is already been accepted for funding, and it's about setting up all the legal and the compliance and all the tra-la-la going around. I think that's enough about my background. I'm of course very happy to take a few questions, or even you can send me emails or find me on LinkedIn so we can talk more on what I do and how can I help. But I suppose we should start by digging onto the topic we have selected for today, should we?
Yeah, of course.
I will try sharing my screen.
Yeah. Try to
how
share.
Does it even work? Share a screen, desktop, share. Okay, I have to allow my computer to share the screen. Sorry about that. I have to quit and reopen Zoom. What a wonderful news. Is that okay? Or I can do it without slides.
You can maybe send to me. I will share with my screen.
All right. Okay, cool. Do you have a MacBook or do you have a Word?
No, it's not Mac.
Okay, because I'm using the Mac software. I'll send you a PDF version somehow. Well, I guess we have an hour.
So Kevin is trying to send me. I will ask all the participants. So if you have any questions regarding fundraising or the whole investment process, you can just leave your questions in the comments, and we will come to the questions. So be free to leave your questions in the end.
Okay. I think that's it. Here you go.
Okay.
Security matters. So yeah, I guess in the meantime, I can talk more about what I've been doing before. So yeah, I've worked with maybe Funderbeam has worked maybe 50 deals altogether for the last 6 or 7 years. What we did essentially at first was building a funding platform, so primary funding, where we work with thousands of investors and they gather their funds into what we call syndicate, and investors can co-invest together with sophisticated investors as one into a company. And later on, we built the first secondary market where investors can actually trade internally to our platform the shares that they've acquired along the investment process, and gain the liquidity that you wouldn't have when investing in a startup in a traditional manner. We're now pretty much all around Europe. Of course, you can invest from anywhere. We cannot fundraise from anywhere, to anywhere at least. And Armenia is not yet part of the list, but hopefully we can. And that's about Funderbeam. You can check out the website, tons of cool startups there, a lot of guidelines as well for entrepreneurs to learn about the funding process, to learn about all of this investment world, which often is very blurry. And all of non-biased information, actually. We've tried to make guidelines appropriate for anyone, whether you're going onto the funding / crowdfunding world or the more traditional way of raising funds. How are we doing? Did you receive the email?
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
I'm opening it now.
I hope I sent you the right one.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay, here is it.
Perfect. So I guess we got a first overview of the fundraising idea, but let's move on to the first slide, the next one. So the first question that many people forget to ask themselves is, should I actually raise funds? I've seen so many companies falling into the trap of the funding trend. Everyone wants to fundraise money. Everyone thinks it's a mandatory matter to fundraise money, and it's not always the case. Many companies can actually grow slowly but steadily into profitable businesses. Of course, many of you are here because you're questioning yourself on how can I fundraise. But first, I always ask, do you actually need to fundraise? You have to keep in mind that if you are taking money from investors, especially traditional investors, meaning angels, VCs, and we'll come to these later, their ultimate goal is to sell your company in order to make big money. So what you have to keep in mind is that when you're raising funds, you're going to give a piece of your company to somebody, and this somebody wishes, or at least wants you to sell the company to make an exit or something like that on the future, and that might not be something suitable for you. But I guess in the startup world, it's what people are looking for: working on a project for a couple of years, growing it, and then selling it to make good money. Now, the other question related to should you raise funds is that before fundraising, try to figure out whether you can actually reach the next milestone without giving away part of your company, for the simple reason that at the very beginning, you'll be giving a piece of your company. It takes a lot of time. You'll have people on your board or people working with you that, on the future might be actually interfering with your company, because you might have a really good relation with your investor right now, but in the future, you don't know how it's going to go. So that's one thing we'll touch upon later on, but just to keep the mind open as of trying to figuring out what are the ways of getting money, or at least growing capital, without having to give away pieces of your company. Again, you can always mention the possibility of grants. Universities at very early stage often provide capital, either governmental capital, university scientific capital, for free. Essentially, it's a little time consuming. You'll have to fill in some paper and try to get that money, that capital flowing in your company to grow the first steps. But always keep that in mind. I think we can move to the next slide. The other question is, how much should you raise? It's a very difficult question. There is so many answers. Again, it all also depends on where is your company located, because the first round in the US might be much smaller than the first round in Eastern Europe or in Estonia or in Armenia. So it really depends. But basically, it comes down to the idea that you have to do the math. You have to figure out what do you need and what is required for you in order to achieve and the next milestones. So it might be hires, it might be investing in technology, might be investing in developing a product to build an MVP for you to get the first thing going, the first traction going. But to keep in mind, and I think the rule of thumb is to try to consider that you're raising your first round without having the need or the will of raising another round later, meaning that you should assume that you will never need to raise again. It's never really the case, because your point here is to grow fast and scale quickly, but you have to assume that. Now, the reality is that you will try fundraising in order to have an 18-month approximately runway where you'll be able to prove your investors that thanks to that money, you have managed to achieve what you've promised them. If we take a breakdown of the different rounds, and I think we'll come to it later, and it also depends on the region you're in. When you raise a pre-seed, you'll be looking around, 20,000 euros. I'll speak euro. I guess it's almost the same for dollars, but you'll be raising for about 20K to 100K. Then the next series is essentially going to be the seed round, where you usually raise between 100 to 1 million euros. And then so on and so on. It can go very big depending on the region, but where I focus the most is usually the pre-seed and the seed round and Series A. Series A can vary between, 5 to 10 million euros, or maybe 3 to 10 million euros, depending on where you are. And one important thing to note on how much you're raising, I always ask people to come up with several plans. You know, minimum target, maximum target, what you think is actually necessary, et cetera, to try having a range for you to be able to play on. You know, how much do you need for your marketing, how much do you need for your devs, et cetera, and try to play on a realm, or at least a range on how much you could be raising, depending on the scenario you're coming up. Again, you know, the size of the investment you're going to receive will also have an effect on your valuation, et cetera, and we'll come up to it later as well. But that's the basic idea. Try to keep in mind that when you're raising money, we can come back. Try to keep in mind that you are raising for an approximate 18-month run rate. Do the math, make sure that you know what you're raising for. Don't go blindly onto the fundraising processes and try to have as accurate figures as you can. When should you be raising funds? Again, that comes up to the next milestone. Have a clear idea on why do you need to raise money, because it takes a lot of time. You need to approach investors anyways. You have to approach investors as soon as you can. It's something you speak to investors when you don't need the money, essentially. If you start speaking with investors when you need the money, then you will be in a bad position, because you will be forced to get the money because your runway is running short, and you will be forced to essentially bend towards investors deals, essentially. So keep that in mind. Try talking to investors even if you don't need the money, because creating a relationship with an investor is not a one night stand. It's something you build a long time. You need to have, you know, a relationship with that investor. So he has to know you, you have to know him. Something very important when you're working with investors, especially at early stage, when you're working with angel investors, for instance, you have to know the person, you have to trust the person, because they'll be working with you one way or another. Another thing to consider in terms of timing is the seasonality. We've had many companies at Funderbeam raising before the summer, and you know, when you have to speak to investors, but they are rich and they're probably hanging out in the Bahamas, exactly like right behind me, or at Christmas time as well. This will delay your fundraising process. So try to figuring out what is the best season for you to talk to investors. In my opinion, try avoiding summers and try avoiding winter holidays, because people will be on hold and it would be very hard to reach out to them. But anyways, just to conclude on when you should raise money, speak with investors when you don't need the money, so you can prepare for the time you actually need the money. If you are very lucky, investors will actually come to you and speak about raising funds. And that's a very good position you're in, because you'll be able to negotiate a better deal. And when I mean a better deal, people are going to invest money in your company in exchange of equity. Therefore, you're selling something which is yours to somebody outside of your realm. So that's the second point. And the third point is to consider the seasonality. When are you raising fund? What's going to be where is going to be the investor? What are they going to do? Are they going to be available? It takes a lot of time. I've had companies coming to me, let's say last August, that they're going to be raising fund and they need the money by December. And in the end, 6 months later, they're still running after the money, either because investors, VCs or investors are going to approach them, start speaking with them, but things become very long. Then you have to discuss about the terms, and it takes a lot of time. So, you know, when people tell you that you'll be raising funds in 3 months, I think it's a lie. I would rather be more conservative and think that fundraising usually takes about 6 months. At least this is my own experience, because there is so much blah, 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 so much administration, especially in my case where we're working with international fundraising, where, you know, you have different legislations, et cetera, and a lot of documentation to be built and gathered. So really see fundraising as something lengthy, time consuming, and not always more important than actually working on your product, or, you know, working on selling your product. I think we can move on to the next round. Oh yeah, I found this very cool graph, good table online, which explains a little bit about, I'll share the slides later. I think everyone can write, either me or Anna, and we can share the slides so you can get access to all of these kind of stuff. But essentially here is the table to explain where investors are playing and at what stage are they playing at. And I'll come back to it just later, just for you to have that aside. So maybe we can move on to the next slide and we can dig onto each of the investor type. So yeah, these are the sources of funds. It really comes down to what stage you are. Really comes down to where you stand in the evolution of your product and the evolution of your company. But essentially here are the main actors, or at least the main terms you'll be facing along your fundraising process. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with that, but I'm trying to make it broad and easy to grasp for those who don't forcefully have a background in business. But essentially, the triple F is the first thing that people usually refer to when they're raising their pre-seed: friends, family, and fools. And these guys are going to be your close one, those who love you and who are ready to invest in you, even if they don't really believe in your product. So it's a very useful source of money. I usually don't recommend working with a triple F for the simple reason that you don't want to involve people you love, your parents, your mom, your dad, whatever, into your business, or even your aunt. You end up at a family dinner for Christmas and you messed up with your company and they gave you 20,000 euros. Well, you might spend worse holidays than you ever thought you would. So this is the triple F: using your family, your close friends, and those who believe in your product blindly to raise your very first capital. Usually you use that as a pre-seed being, try to kick off your idea onto a prototype, an MVP. Sometimes it can be a small little app, etc., etc. The other option, which is a very good option, is the bootstrapping. And many people forget that they can keep on bootstrapping. Bootstrapping means to use your existing resources, to use your existing capital and resources in order to extend your runway. By runway means the time you have to sustain your business without being profitable, to pay your employees, etc., etc. So this is bootstrapping: to use your existing capital in order to keep on existing and keep on running your business. Bootstrapping is a very valid choice of sustaining, because eventually, if you manage to be profitable through bootstrapping, you'll keep shares in your company. Your cap table will look clean. But eventually, if you really want to grow fast, and it's what investors will be looking for, you'll have to raise further and move on to other sources of fundings. Other option, many of you might be familiar because you have access to the BANA network thanks to an accelerator, I suppose. Accelerators are essentially business school boot camps where you'll be held for a couple of months with people who have seen other startups and who can help out building your startups, and usually who are well connected as well, to grow your company by extending your network. And sometimes they will invest a little bit of money in exchange of equity. Sometimes they won't take any equity. But generally speaking, my advice with the accelerator is that you have to go through their track record and try to see whether the accelerator has a history, if they have succeeded in the past, and if they can really bring something to your company, or it's going to be probably a waste of time and a waste of equity. Where I see a lot of value in accelerator is their network, because usually accelerators are surrounded by VCs or by business angels. So they will be able to sustain your growth through external capital investments using their network. And I have a strong emphasis on the capital injection, when actually it's not only about that, but it's also about having a network of people who can bring in smart capital, because you have accelerator which are working together with corporations who potentially can be users of your product. So they can bring capital and network that will help you grow the company into something bigger. I'm thinking particularly of, sometimes you see, hardware companies selling very niche products, and they have a hard time reaching out to consumers, or at least to bigger organizations who might be using their hardware solution. And accelerators are sometimes well connected with these organizations and can try to push on the words toward them. So that's essentially what is an accelerator: a business school boot camp together with investment possibilities and a wide network, able to sustain, to grow your company to the next level. Keep in mind that there are bad accelerators, there are good accelerators. So always dig into what do you think the accelerator can bring to you, and try to see what they have done in the past to really push that out. The other possibility, and it's a very common possibility at an early stage, and it becomes very trendy nowadays, is the business angel possibilities. Business angels are very wealthy individuals, either because they got money from their family, or simply because they were like you, entrepreneurs. They have succeeded in their business, they have received money from other angels, and they want to give back to the startup community. These guys are, I think, very useful, because many of them will be investing in your company, not only money, but also smart capital. They are already working in a specific industry, therefore they will be able to connect you in that industry. And it's, you know, I think it's one of the most useful thing at early stage for early stage companies is to find people who can connect you with the right people who will grow your business. When it comes to angels, make sure that you know the investors. Don't just rush in the decision. Just don't rush in an investor simply because he has money. Try to make sure you know the person, because they will be working with you for quite some time, and they will eventually be able to take a form of decision-making position in your company. If you know them well, you'll be able to understand whether they can only bring capital or if they can also bring smart capital onto the business. One important thing as well regarding reaching out to angels, it's something I'll try to cover all a little bit mixed up, but many people I think have asked, Anna, how do you reach out to investors? Business angels are usually quite easy to reach to. They're looking out for cool investment opportunities. They want to spend their money. I've heard many people saying that business angels are investing as a sport. I don't know whether that's true or not. I'm not a business angel myself, but they like to invest and they like to learn stuff which are within their industry or which concerns them. So, don't hesitate to reach out to them. Don't be boring though. This is one common mistake. Don't spam people. And I feel it's very trendy nowadays to spam people on LinkedIn or whatever and just sending them some random messages without trying to understand what the investor wants, but try to build up, tailored reach out emails or reach out messages to specific investors. So if you are, I don't know, working in the fashion industry and you're looking for a business angel in the fashion industry, look for somebody who knows that industry, introduce yourself, explain what you're doing, explain why it would be interesting for the investor to take a look at what you're doing, and don't take too much of their time. Don't ask them for a 5-hour meeting or a 2-hour lunch on the first occasion. Just offer them to have a quick call and go over what you guys are doing and try to get feedbacks, because again, angels, they are not here only for spending money. They're here for learning and they're here for making connections, and you are here to use all of that. So try making sure that when you meet angel investors, don't praise for money. Try building up a relationship and try to get feedbacks about your product from the investor, because they know a lot. They have been through this kind of stuff, and they can bring a lot of value without even investing. And try to speak with them for a long term. Again, keep them on the loop. Promise them, I don't know, I'm gonna send you my a little update every month or whatsoever, so they can be on the loop and they can see that your company is achieving milestone, and they'll start to feel the hype about your project, and eventually will want to join the deal. Again, fundraising is not easy. You'll have to contact hundreds of people, and probably out of 100 investors, only one will actually follow up with an investment, but all of them will probably be able to bring connections, or they'll probably be able to open doors for you. So don't take a no as a forever no. Essentially, try to exploit opportunities through these networks. And again, one thing we see a lot in that community is that investors speak to one another a lot. So if you kind of burn the bridge between you and investor, it might have consequences on others. So try to keep this very humble and very honest when you're having discussion with investor. I think it's a very key mindset to have, is to be honest in your relationships. Like I've faced hundreds of companies who are looking for funding, and many of them have pitched their idea in a very strict and aggressive manner, and that doesn't make you want to learn more about the people or more about the company, especially since when you're dealing with early stage investments, it's more of investing in the team rather than the product. And this is what people have to keep in mind. Just be who you are and try to learn more than getting the money, and that will eventually bring you opportunities from the capital perspective. Any question on the business angels, Hannah? No?
No.
Okay, cool. Let me know if I'm too fast.
I think it's okay. If people comment if it is okay for you also. If you have any questions about angels, you can leave here. We can come to it during
we can
presentation.
or we can finish up later, up to you. I'll just go on with the different sources of investment. Another funding method, which I'm very familiar with because it's essentially the industry I'm working on, is the crowdfunding. For many years, crowdfunding had a very bad reputation because everybody pictured crowdfunding as being very consumer product oriented through the through these crowdfunding platform, donation-based crowdfunding platforms, when actually I find crowdfunding to be much wider, more complex, and can bring a lot of opportunities to startups. Because aside of the donation-based crowdfunding, you have what we call the equity crowdfunding, and I think it's a very interesting way of raising funds. It's not made for everyone, it's not made for every stages, but from the the seed round up to the late seed Series A rounds, for I would say like between 100,000 euros, 50,000 euros, maybe to 3 or 4 million euros, crowdfunding is a very good opportunity, especially the equity crowdfunding methodology, where, just to summarize it briefly, you'll have hundreds of investors, often professional investors. Sometimes you'll have VCs co-investing together with business angels, who themselves are going to be co-investing together with crowd investors onto what we call syndicates. I mentioned that earlier, but basically syndicates are usually legal entities holding the fund of many investors, and that entity will then invest as one into your company. Many investors in the past have said that crowdfunding is kind of tricky and kind of risky because it messes up your cap table. And I think there was a question about cap tables, so I will try to cover that into this specific topic. But essentially, you don't want to have an overcrowded cap table because it's a total mess to manage. But through equity crowdfunding on a syndicated methodology, only one investor actually lays on your cap table, and that's the syndicates. Therefore, with voting rights and with a well-structured crowdfunding platform, you'll be able to easily manage these investors. That's one thing. The second thing is that crowdfunding in any forms, they have a huge marketing potential. You can build a huge marketing campaign out of your crowdfunding. Sometimes it's actually very useful to have, aside of your main round, a crowdfunding round to involve people of your market, whether it is consumers, whether it is friends, whether it is your community, to join and participate in this round, and that brings your company under the light. And I've seen company raising on crowdfunding from cheese snacks to nuclear reactors. Like recently, we closed a round here in Estonia to build in 10 years small modular nuclear reactors, and people really got involved, and they oversubscribed that round, and it made a huge deal here in Estonia. Using nuclear energy on a crowdfunding. This is something you would have never imagined 20 years ago, I guess. But crowdfunding becomes more and more popular. It has a lot of advantages. It really became a professional way of raising funds. VCs are getting involved. Business angels are hanging around there, and when you are raising fund on a crowdfunding, you'll be able to be in touch with many investors at once, and each of them potentially has value to bring under the form of smart capital. So I think it's a very valid option at a mid stage, post pre-seed up to Series A, a very valid way of doing things. Again, coming to my mind, when you want to expand to a new market and the crowdfunding platform has a good network in that specific market, they'll be able to help you set a foot in that new market. And now about the VCs. Well, VCs, feels to me that VCs nowadays are the gurus of the startup world. They're all so scary, and they also all seem so big, etc. It's just true to some extent, but essentially VCs, what they are investment funds. They're aggregating money from very wealthy people, and then they have the responsibility to invest that money into companies and make them very profitable, or at least to get an exit to make the fund really profitable and get that money back to those who gave the money. So to make it in simple terms, that's the way they work. VCs are very useful at the slightly later stage. Usually you start working with VCs at late seed stage, Series A, up to much later round stages. But essentially, they are very cool and very useful because they have a very deep knowledge of the industry you'll be working in. Because VCs are always very specific to the industry you're working in. So you might have a deep tech company. They will be looking to work with a deep tech VC. And VC will not only give you money, but they will actually play a structural role in your company and help you, govern and direct your company forward. So they'll bring a lot of value added, they'll bring a lot of smart capital, but they will have a tendency to rather be aggressive in their strategy to, grow your company. You will hear many stories of VC kicking out founders simply because it didn't align with the principle that the VCs have set for the company. So you always have to take that into consideration. Another thing, having a VC usually is a very good validation. If you have a reputable VC on your cap table, it will open a lot of opportunity later, because when you have one very famous investor joining into one round, it will attract investors around. And it's the same thing with VC. VC will bring a validation to the deal, will bring a validation to your product, whatever stage you're in. But what you have to be careful about is that many early stage VCs, meaning that they will be investing before Series A at the seed stage usually, they have a very specific strategy. They will invest in a couple of very early stage companies, and they will reinvest only on those which they think are successful and move forward. So the problem here is that if a VC, or even if any investor doesn't come back on a next round, it can actually be a very bad sign for other investors, especially when a VC does that, because people listen a lot to what VCs are doing. And if you have a good VC investing in your company, it might be a very good sign at first, but then they don't come back. It might be a red flag for many other investors. This is something to keep in mind. It's not always the best option at very early stage. Most of the time, VCs know what they're doing. So technically speaking, if they're investing in you, it's usually laying on the good side of the coin. So it's always something to take into consideration. I think we can move on to the next slide.
Yeah, Kevin, let me ask you something, and then we can move. So there is this question that I have. So yeah, we have the sources of fundings, but I hear like a lot of times that many startups that don't have any traction, but they want to attract investors and fundraise at for early stage, in an early stage.
Mm-hmm.
So is it somehow possible, or what should they do in this case if they don't have traction? Can they attract some kind of investment still?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, it always comes down to the very peculiarities of the company. So, what I would suggest for a company which doesn't yet have traction, if the company doesn't have traction for 5 years, it's a very bad sign, and it will be very hard to, convince any investors. But if the company is very young, they do have a prototype, they do have an MVP, they do have something to showcase, but they don't manage to sell it, they don't manage to attract customers. That's part of the game, and it's usually what happens at very early stage of the company growth. So what I usually would suggest is to go with the acceleration, incubation option, and try to get into that form of incubation stage of the company growth, where people will be able to validate your deal without bringing traction. Because if you're being accepted to a very famous accelerator with absolutely no traction, simply a pitch deck and a prototype, you're accepted to a famous accelerator that already will be a form of traction. So again, I don't like to hear that companies don't have traction, because there is always a way to showcase a form of moving forward, whether it is being accepted to a 3-month acceleration program, or whether it is pitching in front of 250. That's a form of traction, So again, it's about how do you conceptualize traction, and how do you manage to market that traction in order to attract investors. The other thing, if you really don't have any traction and you don't manage to, showcase that traction, the only way to do things is to go out. It's not the best time to go out, obviously, but find a way to get in touch with people who can connect you, or with business angels, and, meet them. And just be yourself, be, the people, investors are human at the end. And at the very early stage, they will invest in you as a human, because they believe your product can always change in the future. So, it's a matter of trying to get in touch with these people and just get feedback from them and shard them, essentially. So I don't think there is any right or wrong traction. There is always a way to showcase traction. And it's just a matter of trying to figure out, what do we mean by traction? And it will eventually come, I'm sure.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on.
Yeah, how to approach investors. I answered that question already. Can already answered it, but I think we can always kind of like trim it down and really maybe explain you from my perspective as an investor, since I am representing investors. What happens is that many times people just give you a phone call or send you a very cold email, and they tell you, yeah, check it out, it's a very cool thing, you'll make money out of it. That doesn't work. The best way is to either get a personal connection with the investor, or have someone who can connect you with that investor. Or if you don't know anyone and no one can connect you, try to approach them online, not as getting the money, but as getting their feedbacks on your product. And And that's why I mentioned earlier that it's a very, lengthy and timely process. You'll be speaking with an investor now and you need the money in 6 months, but in 6 months you will still be at a stage discussing, how can they help you out, with whom can they connect you, etc., etc. So I think you have to see connecting investors and speaking to investors as a long-term process. Send them updates, tell them in 3 months we're gonna close 5 partnerships in Southeast Asia, and after 3 months prove them that you have actually done that. Another advice I can give is that never overpromise, whether it is at an early stage or at a later stage, because if you overpromise and underperform, it will always have negative impact on your company profile, essentially. So you would rather, underpromise and overperform, proving that there is an actual momentum and proving that there is an actual opportunity in order for you to really make sure you'll gain the interest of investors. Again, we can go in more depth on that regard afterwards, because there is so much things to speak about, because there is so many different people and so many different investors and different profiles. So I guess it really depends. But I would say just don't be boring and don't be heavy and don't be spammy when getting in touch with investors. They have hundreds of companies under their radar. VCs are even worse. They're reviewing hundreds of companies a week and they don't have time to, deal with BS essentially. So it's more about having an honest relationship and, if possible, a true relationship with the investors. And I guess that's it.
Okay.
Can move on to the next step.
Sure.
The due diligence. Well, this is a very wide and essentially difficult topic, because there are so many things that needs to be reviewed in order to make an investment decision. But maybe I can take you through the things that I would be looking at the first time I meet companies, the first times I meet companies, because usually it's not in 15 minutes you can really know how the people are. But well, anyway, you got my point. The main thing people will be looking at will be obviously the team, and this is very typical for early stage investment. You are not investing in the product, in my opinion, and what I've seen, you're investing at least 50%, even more sometimes, in actually just the team, not the product. When you know that people are passionate, when you know that people have a great background, great connections, that they're able to pull out whatever they say, then you already can know that this is going in the right direction. So, investors, they will be trying to understand who you are. So if you're somebody who is constantly changing project every 2 months, it might have some consequences on the final decision of the investors. But if you're somebody who is extremely passionate about whatever project you are in, and you have been working on it, studying it, and you have hired people and surrounded yourself with the right people, that might be a very positive sign for an early stage investment. Again, at early stage, you don't always have a full team, and it's something that's completely natural and it's part of the game. But essentially, I'll be looking at whether people are full-time, because if I have one founder and he tells me, yeah, I'm working with 10 people, but they're not paid and they work 2 hours a week, I'm like, well, what's the reality behind the involvement of these people? So, what's the deal here? But if he tells me that 3 guys have left their jobs just to work on that project, then I'm like, wow, these guys are committed, Again, about the team, and I think I have another slide speaking about it, but I like to, when you have a technical solution, when you have a software, or if you have an app or something which is tech heavy, then I like to see a technical founder, because if you have a founder who knows nothing about tech but hires some, Indians, or outsources his developments away from home, then it kind of like, I would have some doubts as of whether he can pull out growth of the company. So the background, you have to showcase all of that in your slides, by the way. I'll come back to it later. Now about the market. This is an interesting topic. I work in a very agnostic investment sphere, meaning that we invest in very different projects, and I don't know much about most of the markets we are investing in. So it requires to have some research on the background. So to give you an example, again, the nuclear reactors, when I got these reactor nuclears in front of me, the deck and all the other material, I knew nothing about that. So I had to dig onto it. So I had to check out what the company told me about the markets and what the market really is. And I work, usually VCs or investors, like structural investors, institutional investors, they will be working with analysts, and they will be working with experts in the specific domain. So they will know a lot about your industry, or they will figure out a lot. So when you're speaking about market and you're showcasing your market, I think, you shouldn't blow the numbers so big, because it becomes so obvious and it becomes a red flag at the end. So you would rather try to prove that there is a market, but try to be conservative. with the market size and the market position you may have. Now, same thing with the competitive landscape. We'll always be looking for who else in the market, whether it is direct competition or more indirect competition. So don't be afraid of showcasing that somebody potentially has the exact same solution as you do and try to figure out how you can beat that up. Just be humble and be honest with all of that. It will only bring good. If investors don't invest, there might be a reason in the end, but you always have to show honesty to investors, because they will eventually figure it out and they will either reject the investments or they will just see you with a bad eye. So that's the thing. Now about the opportunity, and I think this is one of the most important true decision-making factor, at least in my opinion, is more of the quantitative approach of investment making, where you'll be looking at the traction. Again, we spoke about the traction. There is always a form of traction from the moment that you are working on a project, you're moving forward. And this is what traction means, essentially. So you manage to sign a contract, you manage to sign an LOI, letter of intent, with the company. They don't even need to buy your product, but they can sign a paper to say that they will support you by buying your product if you manage to put it up. All of these things are traction. You manage to attract, you manage to attract users on your app or whatever. These are traction, and it's very important for us to look at. I can give the example of, for instance, people trying to pull out social media platforms. It's I find very difficult to make a decision, because these are volume based, and if you make a social media platform 10 users in the last 3 months, it's not very good traction. But this is one of the main metrics people will be looking at, and it's just a matter of you trying to conceptualize what traction means in your specific industry and at your specific stage. Traction will also help you define the valuation of your company, and we'll come up to it later. Revenue, very obvious things to look at. Are you actually selling your product? Do you actually have revenue? They'll be looking at that. Customers, same, comes down to the traction, comes out to how many people are using your solution. How do you handle your customers? Are they satisfied? I came across many companies who have showcased, for instance, their ratings on the App Store or on the Google Play Store. And, we'll be looking at this kind of stuff. We'll be looking at how your customers are satisfied by looking at all of that kind of stuff. So there is no point lying. I've seen companies saying they have great ratings. You pull up the iPhone and you check out, and there is very bad ratings. So don't hide this kind of stuff. Try to be honest, and try also explaining what is the plan to counter these issues. And one thing which I look myself as well, and I don't know if it's very relevant to every investors, but I like to look at the connections, because I believe that nowadays you can sell absolutely everything from the moment that you are well connected. And this is what I try to understand in implicit matter. And this is why many investors, and I think I'm part of these people, try to have a form of personal relationship with the people who are entrepreneurs, because I want to know how they are in real life. Because most of the time, people don't showcase who they are in real life. They just pretend to be someone they're not. And if you know who they are, if you know with whom they're hanging out, if you know with whom they're connected, then it can always bring very positive return in the future for an investor. The business model, same thing, very important to look at. There is some copy-paste business model which work very well and which are mandatory in some industries, but there are also some very innovative business models, and this is something which is worth looking at as investors. Try to showcase your business model. If it's something innovative, try to make sure you're able to convey and that you're able to explain your business model easily, because sometimes you have entrepreneurs and they don't manage to explain themselves clearly, and it gets very frustrating and very boring when you're on the other side of the table and you have to listen to so many companies and they don't manage to explain what they're actually doing and the way they're doing it. And if they don't really master that, if the company doesn't master this kind of stuff, then it's already a red flag as well. So I would really suggest to emphasize on knowing how to showcase and explain your business model, and if it's something innovative, make sure to put that in the front to investors. And obviously we'll be looking at whether this is something sexy or not, if it's something people want, and if it's something that goes with market trends. And yeah, I think we can move on to the next slide. which I think is a very similar slide, where it's a little bit more in-depth due diligence stuff. There is so many things people are looking at in the due diligence, but well, I've tried to list out, the most important thing that people will be looking at an early stage. So the team I mentioned, the tech, what tech do you have? How well designed it is, whether it is usable. Whenever I have a new, new potential company coming up to me with an app, I always try to download the app and just try it out myself. And people will do that. There is nothing to hide when you're doing this kind of stuff. And if you have a shitty prototype, don't be afraid of showing out your shitty prototype and explain why it's shitty. We have been working on it for only 1 month. There's only the 2 of us, but look what we've done. It's pretty cool already, and be passionate about selling your tech. That will bring a lot of value to the company later on anyways. Product market fits, same thing, market readiness. This is something hard to gauge because sometimes you have very innovative product, which everyone thinks it's going to turn out to crap, but in the end, it just blooms up. Connections, I mentioned about that. Number of users will be, we look at that. MRR, this is a very important metric. If you're able to showcase that, they will be asking you a lot of questions about the MRR. The cap table is something that people look at as well. I spoke about it a bit before, but I might be emphasizing a little bit more now. So the cap table essentially is usually a very stupid Excel file listing who owns what. I own 30% of the company, she owns 20% of the company, investor A does that, blah, 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 blah. And people will be looking at your cap table for many reasons. If there are too many founders, too many equity being split very randomly, it might cause some problem in the governance of your company because people have to agree on decisions being made in the company at an early stage of the company. It might not sound so important, but when you move on and you potentially have to pivot, when you potentially have to close down a market, when you potentially have to fire people, this can cause a lot of governance issues, and investors will be looking at the quality or at least the depth of your cap table. And it's the same thing with investors. Too many investors is usually a bad sign. If you see an investor coming on the first round but never coming back on the next round, it's going to be a trouble as well. People will ask you, why did this guy never came back? Is there a reason for it? So this kind of stuff. Now we'll also be looking at the patents and the IP. I had a company on the phone yesterday, and they just came out of the university. They are maybe a month old, and they are trying to fundraise, and they don't yet have a patent. They have a disruptive technology. They have some very cool tech behind. It's a PhD guy together with one of his students, and the first thing that came to their mind was like, yeah, we want to raise money, and how do we do? And I was like, well, first try to protect your tech, and also try to increase the valuation of your company by having this patent, and having that secured for you to be able to safely grow, and also to have something to sell if you don't manage to actually produce anything in the end. So, patents is something which I think is particularly important. Business model, and we'll also be looking at obligations and debt, because if a company comes to you, they want to raise 500,000 euros, but they have 1 million euro debt on their shoulders, then you'll be asking, something on the background, and you'd be surprised by the amount of people who try to cover these up. But in the end, the memorandum, the investment memorandum, always ends up in the hand of somebody who is digging into the financials and figures it out one day or another. So investment never happens. So this is something you have to be aware when you're taking a debt, when you're taking a loan. Always make sure that you clearly state that to your investors, because they don't have to fund it themselves. And also make sure that you know what you're digging into when taking a loan. It's the same as giving out equity. You have to be sure of what you're doing. But it's a very common thing to do to get loans, and it's not something I'm advising not to do. On the contrary, if you do need a loan and you're sure you can pay it back to, buy some machinery to fill up your peanut butter jars that you're selling, then do it if your financials allow you to do. Then valuation. This is a very common question, I think, that everybody is asking themselves. I'm not sure I will have the answer for that, because at an early stage valuation, I've always seen people doing, this is my valuation. You never really know
Yes.
how to evaluate your company. Depending on what market you are, on what industry you are, valuation will range enormously. But I mean, my main advice on the valuation is to try to look at what others are doing and what are the typical valuation ranges in your specific industry and at your specific stage. So, if we take the European market, or at least the market I've been working on, pre-seed, you'll have valuation between 500,000 to 1 million euros. Seed, you'll have 1 million up to 5 million euros, and then it goes bigger. Again, there is no secret recipe to it, but what you can try doing is to you know, have a proportional a rule of proportionality. So if let's say you are raising 2 million euros, you'll so basically, like, usually at an early stage, you'll be giving about 20% of equity to the investors. So what you can do, you can use this 20% to set up your valuation. So if you're raising 2 million euros, you'll set up your valuation around 10 million euros. It's 20% of 10 million is 2 million euros. So this is how you would calculate it using the amount you are willing to give away. And again, having a too small valuation will end up very bad for you, and having a too high valuation, you will never manage to raise money. Now, things which can be used in order for you to set up and grow your valuation and justify your valuation, which I think is the main thing that I can answer here, is to try to list out every aspect which add value to your company, essentially. So you have a team of PhDs. These guys went to school for 10 years, 12 years in order to get their degree, and that's already a good value to add to your company. You have managed to get this guy on board. It's very important. Then you might also be asking, you know, we have secured 2 potential contracts with a bigger brand. That's something you can add to justify your valuation. You have signed LOIs with potential clients. You have that many users. You have invested that much onto developing your tech. So, you know, you have to bring all of the aspects that make your company an existing economic actor and try to justify a valuation based on the market standard. You know, what your competition has been raising, how do they have been raising, and anyways, it will always come up. The conclusion will, for most of the time, be the investor's decision. So I would always suggest to try to figure out what's the valuation of your company, push it up a little bit so that you can have some room for negotiation, because the investor will have the last word usually. Now, one thing you can try to do as well, you can try to speak with many investors, stimulate the interest in many investors, and start a bidding war where you have many investors interested in the investment opportunity, and because they will be fighting for the investment, you will have a little bit more leverage in arguing on your valuation. For those who don't forcefully know what valuation is, essentially valuation is the price you're setting your company, the price your company is, and you know, more you sell of your company, less equity you'll get in your company. And then we come down to the principle of dilution. So if you sell too much of your company, you will have less power inside of your cap table, and you'll have, you know, when the company explodes into, you know, a unicorn and you set it out, you'll make less money. So anyway, that's a brief introduction to what valuation is. Again, one important thing about valuation: you might have some investors who are okay with the higher valuation, but they will provide very bad terms, very bad term sheets, very strict and aggressive term sheets, while others will have, you know, lighter valuation but more flexible terms. And you know, sometimes this is something you have to take into consideration, and I really recommend you to eventually raise at a lower valuation but with better terms than the other way around, and I think it's very logical. But don't be too greedy on that one. And again, yeah, always read whatever paper you're signing when this is obvious, but always make sure to read and argue on whatever paper you're signing when raising funds. It's a very complex process. It requires often legal advice, but make sure you are aware of what you're doing when you're raising the funds. I think many people will have questions on the valuation, so we can come back to it after, or maybe people drop questions here already.
I guess let me check just.
Oh, it's already 1 hour I'm speaking.
Oh yeah, let's move on. We will come to the question.
Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. Should I continue with the presentation real quick, or should I close it up? I can't hear you anymore. You muted yourself.
Oh, sorry.
Investment vehicles. I'll be very quick about this one. I think it's an important thing. So there are plenty of investment vehicles, from loans, etc., but the two main things you'll see are convertible notes and equity. At very early stage of the companies, usually people like to with convertible notes, and it's a very trendy thing. Convertible note, basically investors are giving you a loan which will then be transformed into equity later in the stage of your company. Usually when you raise the next round, so let's say you're taking a loan from your investors, they will either ask you to pay back the money if you don't manage to raise, or they will simply have a discount on the next round they're raising because they took more risk because they invested before, so they will have a discount rate on the next round. The valuation cap as well. If your company reaches a certain valuation, the loan will transform into equity, but essentially that's what it is. An equity, well, you are adding someone on your board seat and you're giving away part of your company. We can come back later on that. Maybe we'll move on forward real quick. Pitch deck structure. I spoke about it before, but be simple, be honest. Depend on the industry again, but I don't really like receiving a first deck with tons of information, graphs and metrics everywhere. It just doesn't make you want to read it, doesn't make you want to dig for the information. What I suggest to do is to have a very thorough and straightforward deck and be able to add some further information on side documents, either a one-pager or another form of document that investors can look at if they really have some further questions, but be very simple. We can move on to the next slide. And here is the...
Let me ask just one question. Here we have one which is related to it. So in the competitor slide of the pitch deck, should we also mention the large companies which are not direct competitors now, but can easily move to our market from their niche in the future?
Yeah, and I mean, like one of the, you can move to the next slide in the meantime. One of the things that I also recommend to some extent is to showcase the risk, and that's part of the risk that a company with big money can easily replicate what you're doing. And I mean, don't go too in depth by listing out the 450 companies which are potential competitors, but try to bring an understanding to the investor that this is a possibility, and it's always a form of honesty. So I would definitely recommend doing that. Investors are not stupid, they will double check and they will probably have their own perspective on who potentially is your competitor, but make sure to know your competition. If you don't cite any competition and say that you're the only one on the market, usually it's a red flag. Anyways, very brief. This is the pitch deck structure I would provide. Problem, solution, business model, market, traction. This is things you usually see on any kind of deck. Team and advisors. Advisor, it's also the network you are working with. So if you are working with famous advisors, it will usually be a very good sign for investors. Competition, as I mentioned, be honest with this one. Capital, what do you do with the money that you have? What did you do with the money you have fundraised before? And how did you spend that capital? And fundraising, what are you going to do with the money? And what are the terms that you're setting? The valuation, the amount you're going to give, et cetera, et cetera. What are the terms of the upcoming funding round? And who are you looking for? Try to be specific. You are working in a deep tech. I want to find an investor who is qualified in the deep tech and potentially can bring me this, and that, not only money. It's something always charming for investors. And you can also add the exit option. What is your plan in the future to show investors that even though you are at an early stage, you already know what direction you're going to. They know how they're going to make their money that way. And maybe they can even advise you. You can move on. And here is something that I will keep for sharing, I think, but it's the data room. Not many people are so aware about that, but I find it super useful when you're dealing with investors. You want to make sure that all the information related to your company is being aggregated in a shareable file. Many of these points that I added on the screen are not always relevant to you. I just added everything which I thought would be potentially relevant. So, make sure to cherry pick whatever you think is relevant. But the idea here is that if you speak with an investor and they ask you a P&L and then the next day they ask you a shareholders agreement, blah, 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 then it's a never-ending sharing process of information, which is not very professional. But if you share data room, a Google Drive link to your investors, and there will be access to all of this information, they will be like, wow, these guys are professional. They know what they're doing. They know how to store the information. It's going to be useful for the investors, but also for new employees, for anyone who potentially come and help you out in the company to access this information at hand, essentially. So I'll share the deck to whoever wants it, and you can just go through all this data points, and you can ask me questions if you want to. But this is what I would add, and what is usually necessary for sharing to investors.
Okay.
Yep. And the red flags. Well, I spoke about it along the way, but you have a list of red flags and you can use it. And these are the things that we will be looking at. Blind optimism, when you have somebody coming to you and they're gonna be the next Apple in 3 weeks. Well, obviously you're like, haha, I don't think so. I'm not gonna go through all of them, but bad market studies, you can feel it when you dig into it. I don't know, no technical founder, I spoke about it. In early investors not following up, we spoke about it as well. Unrealistic forecast. There is no point saying you're gonna be owning 70% of market share when you just started. Just be honest with yourself and be honest with the others, and it will work out fine. But anyways, I'm gonna share that so you can dig into it.
Okay.
I think that was the last slide, was it?
Yeah, I guess this is the last. There is, yeah. Okay. Okay, so let me stop sharing.
Yes.
Okay. So Kevin, I have a couple of questions here that people want answers. So the
sure.
first one, let's go and answer some 3-4 questions, and then the other questions we will leave, like if there are unanswered questions, maybe they can write you or they can write us, and we can forward them to you. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so the question is the following: how is the fundraising of hardware startups different from software startups? So is there kind of different?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in theory, there is not that much difference. It's usually the same protocol and the same processes and the same legal frameworks. The only main difference is in practice, when you're working with the hardware, you will be looking for very specific investors. And again, how do you define hardware? Is it a backpack or is it a jet engine? You know, if you're working with a very complex and niche product, then you will be looking for very specific investors. And also from the investment perspective, hardware, you have to look at kind of different metrics. It's very hard to pivot when you're working on a jet engine. What is easier to pivot when you're making a social media app, you know? So these are the differences which might sound obvious, but they will really play a role in the decision making of the investors and in the approach you have to take as a company to investors. You can't go to random investors who are specialized in social media when you are making hardware. However, cool thing about hardware is that it's easier to explain maybe, and you can also use a lot of crowdfunding that way. When I'm thinking about consumer product, for instance, something you can really, you know, have a relationship and share to your crowd essentially. So, you know, the fundraising options will differ a little bit, the story will differ a little bit, but there will be some downside as well to the hardware side.
Okay. Let's go to next. So the next is the following. It said, this person says, what can be good options for funding to pursue for startup creating mobile app in edutech?
In edtech, yeah. We're just raising for a company in edtech actually. So interesting. All options are viable. You'll be working, you know, depending on what edtech you're doing, you might be working with the public organizations as well, who have a very good interest in stimulating technology in the educational sphere. So it's always very interesting to try to dig into public options, especially at an early stage, because they will be able to provide a lot of support and they can potentially even be your clients. I've seen some companies in the edtech industry who pulled out their app with public fundings, and they managed to, you know, give their app trial or even selling it to universities or schools, and that's an amazing form of traction to validate the product. So I wouldn't say that there is any specific a form of investment structure you'll be going for, because in the end you'll be looking for specialized accelerator in edtech or in app development. You'll be looking for business angels who have had the experience or who are interested in this topic. You'll be looking for VCs who are working in the edtech industry, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, this is the way you have to think. For every project and every industry, there is investors matching the industry, or the knowledge at least.
Okay, thank you. Let's see what is next. Okay, there says, please, first of all, this person thanks very much for your inputs, very useful and interesting. So please, can you elaborate a little bit more about how much is the usual percentage that investors are receiving for their investment? And is there difference between investment organizations? They work the same way, meaning they receive equity in the organization. Little bit longer.
Yeah, so yeah, I understand the question. It's an interesting question. Again, it's difficult to bring up average because it really depends. From what I know, accelerators, or, you know, very early stage kind of incubators, accelerator, they will take 5-10% or something like that. Business angels, they will be business angels and VC at a slightly later stage, they will be looking between 10, 15 20%. When you go above 20%, it's kind of like blurry water, or however you say that. So this is the range that you're usually playing at, and the structure, the internal structure of institutional investors are usually the same. We could speak at another time on how VCs are being structured, how accelerators are being structured, but essentially, yeah, they will most of the time either look for equity in your company, either right now or later in the future through convertible debt. But it's usually very similar principle for any countries. I think, I don't know every country, but from what I've heard, at least in Europe and in the United States, the logic and the mechanics are very similar in these industries.
Okay, thank you. And the last question for today, here is it. Will investors invest in a company which is a competitor for one of the investors' portfolio companies? If yes, in what circumstances?
I don't really understand the question here. If the investor is investing
will investors invest in a company which is a competitor for one of the investors' portfolio companies? Like maybe the investor has a portfolio, and like, can he invest in one which is the competitor of the other?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, it's a little bit of a douche move to do that, because if you are working closely with a company and you invest in their competition, it's like, oh, what the hell is going on? But I'm pretty sure plenty of VCs, bigger institutional investors, have invested in different projects which potentially are very similar, and they are trying to grow them all and see whomever succeed. And the reason why they would do that is because one or the other will either succeed better than the other, and they would just get rid of the least successful ones. But typically speaking, investors will avoid that.
Okay. So since we're out of time, I guess all other questions, if they are not answered, we can forward to Kevin, and we can maybe leave the contacts of Kevin in the comments. So if you have any questions, or if you have some startups that you want advising, or you think that you can pitch to Kevin and get some comments, I guess you're free, right, Kevin?
Yeah, feel free to add me on LinkedIn or to send me an email. You guys will share my mail, but you can just write me. And if you have any, I've been helping BANA for a few months now, and I'm trying to meet their community and try to see however I can help. And I'm very happy to meet anyone in your ecosystem. So just feel free to reach out. And if you want to dig more in depth onto this topic, maybe we can have another session in a few months or something and speak of more specific fields in that domain.
Okay, great. So let me say also one thing. If any of you want the slides, you can write us. You can write me, Anna, at bana.am. Write me, and I will just send the pitch deck to you. I will write the email in the comments. So stay with us. We will come with new webinars soon. So that's it, I guess, for today. Thank you everyone for being with us. Thank you, Kevin, for a nice presentation. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.